Alien beastwoman with thunder wings carries me into combat and refuses to let me down. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Damon's world was upside down. Quite literally. One moment he'd been troubleshooting a relay panel aboard the diplomatic ship Halcyon Whisper, and the next a missile had torn through their shielding, sending them spiraling into the planet's atmosphere. He remembered the sirens, the frantic shouting, the desperate attempts to regain control. But most of all, he remembered the silence that came after, broken only by the high-pitched whine in his ears, and the gut-trenching impact as escape pods shattered like glass on the storm-racked surface below. When he finally came to everything around him, was broken. The pod cracked open like an egg smoke curling upward into a bruised sky, plasma storms churning in the distance. His ankle throbbed, blood stained his forearm, but he was alive, and from what he could tell alone, he didn't stay still. Damon wasn't a soldier, but he wasn't helpless either. Years of working comms on the outer circuits taught him how to move quickly, quietly, and with purpose. He salvaged a working transmitter from the wreckage, rerouted power through a broken med scanner's capacitor, and tried to send a distress ping. Nothing. Static. The storm overhead wasn't natural. The electromagnetic interference was too patterned, too focused. Someone or something was jamming the skis. The first threat came less than 20 minutes later. Not a beast or alien, no, this was worse. An autonomous sentry drone scavenger class with a cracked chassis and a thirst for salvage. Damon ducked behind wreckage as it scanned the debris, laser aperture glowing faintly red. He held his breath, crawling inch by inch toward a half-buried rifle he'd spotted near another body. Just before he could reach it, a shadow screamed down from above. There was no warning. One moment, the sky crackled. The next bolt of blue and white slammed into the drone with a sound like thunder cracking bone. The machine exploded in a shower of metal, and standing over it, wings spread wide, electricity dancing along her feathers, was something Damon had only heard about in whispered conversations and outpost stories. The beast woman was massive, easily 7 feet tall, even hunched forward. Her electric blue wings shimmered with barely contained voltage, feathers stiff like blades and fur streaked with white. She had curved horns like lightning bolts and eyes that glowed molten amber, scanning the wreckage for more threats. And then those fierce eyes landed on him. Before Damon could speak, she was on him. A blur of fur, muscle, and ozoneless scent. She pinned him down, clawed hands gripping his shoulders, not hard enough to draw blood, but more than enough to show she could. She growled something in her own tongue before switching rough and guttural to intercommon. "You are the soft one," she snarled. "The cargo tech. You smell like copper and fear." He blinked. "Yeah, well, I just got shot out of the sky. Sorry, I didn't bring cologne." That surprised her. Her nose twitched. A snort of breath escaped her fanged mouth somewhere between a scoff and amusement. She tilted her head, considering. "You are the last, as far as I know." The beast woman, he didn't yet know her name, nodded once and yanked him to his feet like he weighed nothing. Damon winced as pain shot through his ankle, but he gritted his teeth and said nothing. She noticed anyway. With one swift motion, she scooped him into her arms, wings folding and tightly. "You cannot run. I will carry." "I'm not dead weight," Damon muttered. "You are all weight," she replied, "and dead if you stay here." With that, she launched into the sky. It was like being hurled through a thunderstorm by a living rocket. The wind roared in his ears. Her wings beat with staggering force, each flap sending electrical ripples down her feathers. She didn't fly so much as carved through the sky. Damon clung to her instinctively as the wreckage below shrank into chaos. He caught glimpses of battlefields, crashed ships, smoldering husks, twitching machines, and storms that pulsed unnaturally like veins in the clouds. Wherever they were, it wasn't a natural war zone. Someone was shaping the weather like a weapon. She didn't speak again until they landed atop a twisted, calm spire jutting from the wreckage like a skeletal finger. Here, the view stretched across the ruined valley, storm clouds clawed at the sky, plasma lightning forked in the distance, and scattered wreckage burned faintly beneath the gloom. She set him down and stepped away, watching him test his footing with a limp. "You're not one of ours," he said. "So what are you doing out here?" "I was hunting," she said. "Now I am watching over you." "That's a quick change of plans." "You're not worth eating," she said, then added after a pause, "but maybe worth something else." Damon shook his head. "Fantastic! My first alien rescue, and I'm a curiosity." She turned then, wings stretching wide as they caught a stray gust of static-charged wind. "I am Nina of the Stormclaw," she said. "Exile, but still a better flyer than any of my kin. Your ship entered restricted skies. You were a warning or bait." He narrowed his eyes. Bait for what? "Something worse than me." That was when the sky split open again. Not with light, but with shape, serpentine machines with spinning blades and glowing red cores. Not drones, not local, something older, something repurposed. Damon's breath caught in his throat. Nina was already moving, claws at the ready, wings crackling with rising current. "Hold on, soft one," she growled. "They will not take you." And before Damon could argue, she grabbed his hips again and launched skyward, into the lightning, into the battle, into whatever hell waited above. The wind screamed past Damon's ears as Nina carried him through the electric sky. Her claws were firm on his waist, wings slicing through clouds thick with ozone and crackling plasma. He was jostled with every shift of her muscular frame, but he held on, gripping the leather-like harness strapped across her chest. The sky wasn't just dangerous, it was alive. Bolts of lightning snaked between clouds, some natural, others artificial, dancing across the field of wreckage far below. Damon had no control over where they were going, but from the determined set of her jaw and the tension coiled in her shoulders, it was clear Nina did. She didn't speak. Her focus was pure. Scan the sky, dodge the hazards, move like thunder. Damon had to admit, somewhere in the chaos of it all, he was impressed. She wasn't just strong. She was tactical. She weaved through the ruined aerial corridors of downed ships and shattered satellites like she had flown this route 1,000 times. But the way her head turned slightly, the flicker in her ears, the way she adjusted her path in jagged spurts, it told a different story. She didn't know this place either. She was adapting in real time, learning the terrain like a hawk scanning prey from miles above. He kept quiet, knowing she didn't need distraction. The machines chasing them, however, weren't so considerate. The first one dropped in from above, its red core glowing like an evil star. It fired a pulse of blue energy that just missed Nina's wingtip, searing through a fragment of metal wreckage below. Nina jerked hard to the left, tucking her wings just enough to let them drop before spreading wide and catching an updraft. The move threw Damon's stomach into his throat, but it also put them behind a falling freighter carcass, buying them a few seconds. She flared her wings again and shot upward, wind slamming into them both. The machine followed, relentless and mechanical, like it didn't even register the storm. "You got a plan!" Damon shouted over the wind, his voice nearly lost in the rush. "I fly," she snapped. "You stay alive." Not very tactical. Not dead either. The second machine appeared from the side, firing a net of plasma that arched toward them in glowing lines. Damon's eyes widened, and he grabbed a shard of twisted hull from the wreckage they just passed. Holding it awkwardly with both hands, he twisted midair and managed to toss it between them and the net. The scrap metal absorbed most of the energy, bursting in a flash of fire that rocked them. Nina looked back, blinking against the flare. For a heartbeat, her expression wasn't annoyed. It was impressed. "I thought you were soft. I'm a calm's tick, not a coward. That net would have cooked your bones. I figured dying slower wasn't a win." She smirked, or at least it looked like a smirk. Hold tighter. Before you could question it, she folded her wings and dropped like a stone. The world spun. Damon clung to her, the sky turning into a blue-white blur above as they fell through a pocket of dead air. The machines overshot, scrambling to adjust, And that was when Nina twisted mid-dive, opened her wings again, and drove her lightning-charged talons straight into the underbelly of the closest one. Sparks erupted. The machine screeched as if alive, flailing before exploding in a storm of flame and metal. The other two hesitated, giving her the chance to glide them to safety toward a broken station tower, still jutting out from the clouds like a skeletal spire. She landed hard on the outer edge of the platform, her claws digging into the metal, breathing fast. Damon slid off her back, legs shaking as he caught himself against the rail. The tower was part of an old communications hub, long abandoned, its shell stripped by time and war. They were at least 2 kilometers above the surface, surrounded by swirling clouds and broken satellites. The wind was thinner here, colder, but it gave them breathing room. Nina paced the platform, scanning the skis, then turned to him. "You fight well with garbage." Damon leaned against the rail, catching his breath. "It's called improvisation." She crouched beside him, wings folding inward, crackling softly as they absorbed ambient energy. Her eyes narrowed. "What else can you improvise, soft one?" He looked around. The remains of the comms tower still had some intact panels. A few were fused shut, but others blinked with faint life. He pushed past her and knelt by a maintenance port, prying it open with a cracked rod from his gear. "If I can access the core relay," he said, "I might be able to bounce a signal through the orbital junk field, not enough to call in a cruiser, but maybe enough to throw off their tracking." Nina tilted her head. "Make them chase ghosts." "Exactly. Then do it." He worked quickly. It wasn't the cleanest job. Half the wiring was burned out and the interface was older than he was, but Damon rerouted the signal processor through the emergency beacon loop. He powered it with the last cell in his wrist scanner, fingers shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline. As the system sparked to life, he rigged a pulse burst into the wave, encoding false telemetry readings on multiple frequencies. The machines looking for his heat signature would suddenly detect a dozen versions of it, scattered across the battlefield. When it was done, he turned back to her. "It's up. We've got 5 minutes tops before they recalibrate." Nina looked at him like he'd grown claws of his own. Soft ones usually panic, scream, beg. "I'm used to being the quiet guy in the back room. Just never thought I'd have to work while flying through hell in a death grip." She stood tall, wings spreading slowly again, residual lightning crackling at her wingtips. "You are not weak, strange, but not weak." That almost sounded like a compliment. "Almost," she said, then grabbed him around the waist again. "Come, if we make it through the next storm, you earn another one." They launched into the sky again, streaking through the artificial tempest. The ghosts Damon had programmed danced in the distance, luring away red-eyed predators. Beneath them, the war-scarred world churned. Around them, the wind roared like a challenge, and between them, a thin thread of understanding, uneasy, fragile but growing, held tight like her grip on his side. They rode the storm's edge until Nina's wing began to falter. Damon felt it before he saw it. Her flight pattern shifted slightly, a faint stutter in her otherwise flawless rhythm, as though she were compensating for a loss of strength. Her grip on him remained firm, but he could feel the subtle tremble in her arms. She was pushing past her limit. The wind around them screamed louder, plasma flashes lighting the clouds in rapid bursts, and Damon knew they couldn't stay airborne much longer. Below them, a ruined gunship lay embedded in the side of a jagged cliff, a torn relic from some older conflict, half buried and scorched, but its hull still intact enough to offer shelter. Damon tapped her shoulder and shouted over the roar of the storm, pointing toward it. She hesitated only a second before folding her wings and diving, trailing sparks behind her. They crashed down hard against the broken plating, sliding along the scorched metal until Nina's claws dug in and halted them. Damon rolled off her as gently as he could, bracing himself against the cold surface, his breath ragged. Nina staggered but caught herself on one knee, wings drooping, one twitching more erratically than the other. Damon stepped forward, reaching to steady her, but she snarled, jerking away, barring her fangs like a warning shot. He didn't flinch. Instead, he gave her a steady look and pointed at the gash along her upper wing joint, a wound he hadn't noticed in the chaos of the last battle. The edges were scorched and frayed, a deep burn that had to have come from a close-range plasma strike. "You're injured," he said calmly. "That's why your flight's off." "It is nothing," she growled, though her voice was tighter than before. "It will mend." "It'll mend faster if you don't tear it open wider." She didn't respond, but she also didn't stop him when he dug into the emergency pouch he'd salvaged earlier. He found a pressure injector loaded with nano-sealant, standard issue on most human transport ships. As he approached her wing, she tensed but allowed it, turning her head away. Her muscles quivered beneath the jagged white fur, and her feathers sparked faintly as the chemical hissed into her wound, sealing and dulling the worst of the burn. Damon worked silently, carefully, avoiding any sudden movement. She was a predator, even hurt, but the fact that she let him do this said more than words could. When he finished, she flexed the joint, testing it with a low grunt. Then she looked at him again, really looked with a sharp, assessing gaze that seemed to measure not just his actions, but his intentions. "You are different than the others. Than other humans. Than other liabilities." Damon chuckled. "Guess I'm an upgraded model." For a moment, her amber eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement. She stood fully again, turning toward the twisted interior of the gunship. "We wait here until the storm weakens, then we move." He nodded, following her inside. The interior was a mess of torn cables, shattered control panels, and blackened bones. Whatever crew had once manned, the vessel had died a long time ago. Damon found a relatively clean corner and began pulling apart the ship's remaining systems, hopping for something, anything salvageable. Nina remained near the entrance, crouched low, her back to the wind, eyes fixed on the shifting clouds outside. She was alert even in rest, like she couldn't afford to let her guard down. He didn't blame her. Out here, trust was a luxury. As he stripped wires and rerouted power through a busted interface console, Damon worked in silence. Every so often he glanced at her, nodding how her breathing steadied, how the crackle around her wings dimmed slightly with rest. Despite the cold air and the faint smell of burned circuitry, there was a strange calm to the moment. They were both running, both hunted, but neither entirely alone anymore. That counted for something. Eventually she spoke again, her voice softer but still edged in caution. "Why were you on that ship?" "I was a technician. They needed someone to monitor the diplomatic beacon systems. It was supposed to be a safe run." "Safe?" Her lip curled faintly. "There is no safe sky in this sector. The stars lie. I'm learning that the hard way." She leaned back slightly, her wings shifting with the creak of old metal. "You handle yourself better than I expected. Not with strength, but with thought. That's usually the part people overlook. Most humans I've met come screaming or shooting. I try not to do either unless I have to." She gave a quiet huff, almost a laugh, and finally turned her gaze fully on him. "I was exiled for refusing an order. My commander wanted to level a settlement to stop a rebellion. I refused, said the civilians weren't combatants. He said that made me weak. I broke his jaw." Damon looked up from the terminal, his hands stilling on the panel. "Sounds to me like it made you the only one with a conscience." He said compassion had no place in war. "Well, then maybe war is the problem." They stared at each other for a beat, and something subtle passed between them. Not sympathy, not quite understanding, but a recognition of burden, of being the odd one out, of refusing to just go along with what everyone else calls survival. Nina's eyes softened just slightly. Then she shifted her weight and looked away again. "We leave when the wind dies," she said. "Until then, rest. You'll need your strength." Damon didn't argue. He finished patching what he could of the console, set up a low-energy signal loop that might help them later, and leaned back against the wall. The hum of distant thunder rolled over them like a lullaby soaked in danger. He didn't close his eyes fully, just enough to recharge, just enough to breathe. He wasn't sure when it happened exactly, but at some point during the silence, he realized she had moved closer. Not by much, just a step, just enough to bridge the space between warrior and technician, between exile and survivor, between two strangers caught in a storm finding shelter in each other's presence. By the time the storm relented, the silence outside the wreckage felt unnatural. No wind howled through the jagged gaps in the hull, no lightning danced along the clouds. The sky, though still cast in a gray-green haze, was momentarily calm. Nina stood first, stretching her wings with deliberate care. The sealed wound along her joint held, though Damon could tell she was testing her limits. She glanced at him with a nod that wasn't quite approval, but close enough. He stood and checked the small pulse beacon he'd rigged from spare parts. It blinked faintly, still functioning, though just barely. It wouldn't call for help, but it might buy them a few more tricks if they needed to mislead tracking signals again. Nina moved to the edge of the ship's torn frame, crouching low to scan the skis. Damon followed, careful not to speak until she gave the all-clear. When she did, she didn't speak either. She just gestured with a quick motion and leapt from the edge, wings spreading wide, feathers sizzling with stored voltage. Damon barely had time to brace before she caught in midair again. Their flight this time was lower, weaving through the valleys of wreckage that littered the mountainsides below. They didn't rise above the cloud line again. Instead, they stayed close to broken terrain. Old engines, ship husks, buried gun ports from wars long past. Damon knew she was avoiding detection, and that meant they were being hunted more closely than before. He kept watch as best he could while she flew, scanning the terrain and the skis for movement. After some time, he spotted a glimmer of motion to the west, something sleek and dark flying with controlled rhythm. Not a drone, not human either. It was Talvorin. "Nina," he said, pointing without shouting. She twisted mid-flight, eyes locking on the distant shape. For a moment, she hovered, then shifted direction toward a narrow ridgeline. They descended fast and landed behind the cover of a collapsed tower. She dropped him to the ground and crouched low, peering through a shattered visor port at the sky above. The flyer circled once, then descended slowly toward the far end of the ridge. "They followed me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Damon. "Is that one of yours?" "Yes," she said. "But not mine." Damon didn't press. He followed as she moved along the edge of the ruined structure, keeping low and silent. They reached a jagged outcropping just as the flyer landed. A tall figure dismounted. Another winged beastwoman, though taller than Nina, brought her through the shoulders. Her wings plated with dull black steel along the edges. Her horns were shaped more like hooked blades, and her expression was unreadable. She wasn't alone. Two smaller Talvorin warriors dropped from the flyer behind her, claws ready, expressions cold. The leader's eyes scanned the wreckage below and locked onto Nina's position. She didn't shout. She just spoke in a deep, carrying tone. "Nina of the Stormclaw, you wear shame like it is armor. Step forward and answer." Nina exhaled through her nose, then stood. "Commander Calith," she said plainly. "Still sending others to do your fighting." Calith's lips curled slightly, still hiding behind off-worlders. Damon stayed where he was tense, unsure whether this was diplomacy or the lead into a fight. Calith pointed at him without moving her feet. "The human is your claim." "He is my choice," Nina answered. "My wing bunt by action and necessity." Damon blinked. "I'm your what now?" Calith's face didn't change, but the two warriors behind her exchanged glances. "That claim makes him yours. His life is yours. His death is yours. He is not dying. Then prove your bond." Damon stepped forward, frowning. "I don't know what any of this means, but I'm not some trinket you fight over. I can speak for myself." Calith looked at him like she would an animal trying to read a map. "He has tongue," she said flatly, "but not wings." Nina shifted her weight, wings flaring wide, body tense. "Then I challenge by trial, flight, and fire." Calith's wings twitched. "You are still Talvorin enough to invoke the old right." "I never stop being Talvorin. You just stop seeing it." Calith nodded once. "Then choose your course." Without another word, the Talvoran warriors took to the air, Calith rising behind them. Nina turned to Damon. You'll need to hold on. No interruptions, no suggestions. I fly. You survive. Damon didn't argue. She grabbed him by the waist and launched into the air again. This time it wasn't escape. It was a duel. The Talvoran test wasn't just flight, but agility, maneuvering, energy use, and control while protecting a non-winged companion. Damon's presence made Nina heavier, her moves slower. That was the point. It was a contest designed to punish weakness and test trust. Calith dove first, wings humming with electric buzz. Nina rolled them to the side, flaring her feathers and spinning just under a shattered bulkhead jutting from the wreckage. The others followed, one from below, one from the side. Nina twisted, pulling them upward in a tight spiral that made Damon grit his teeth to stay conscious. The enemy warriors coordinated, trying to box them in, forcing her into predictable paths, but Nina didn't take the obvious escape routes. She turned into narrow crevices, skimmed twisted debris fields, and dropped suddenly into dead air pockets before catching herself again. Damon felt every pulse of her wings, every strain of her breath, every snap of muscle as she pushed her wounded body through the course. One of the warriors came too close, expecting her to veer away. Instead, Nina spun sideways mid-flight, Damon barely holding on, and slammed her wing edge into the attacker's face. Feathers crackled with voltage. The other broke formation, trying to compensate, and Calith was suddenly alone in the chase. She came harder, faster, her wings glowing as she pushed herself into a dive that sparked against the air. Nina didn't outfly her. She outthought her. She used Damon's earlier signal pulse, still bouncing erratically through the debris field, to draw Calith's eyes just a half-second off course. It was enough. Calith clipped the edge of a ruined pylon and spun out, wings folding just in time to catch herself before crashing. Nina landed again, hard but steady, her chest heaving. Damon dropped to his knees beside her, dizzy but intact. Calith landed moments later, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly toward them, stopping a few paces away. "You've won the trial," she said without inflection. "The human is yours." "He was always mine," Nina answered. Calith gave the faintest nod of respect, then turned away. Her warriors followed. The flyer lifted off moments later, disappearing into the clouds. Damon finally exhaled. "You want to explain what just happened?" Nina looked at him, eyes glowing faintly. "You are mine now in Talvoran law. That was not for show." Damon raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does mine mean?" She stepped closer. "It means I fly with you, fight with you, and you do not fall unless I do first." Her hand brushed his briefly, claws gentle for once. "It is a bond, not a cage." And for the first time, Damon believed her. The clouds above were bruised with electricity, but no longer raging. After the Talvor and flyer vanished into the gray horizon, Nina didn't speak. She simply stood there, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a warrior coming down from battle. Damon sat on a broken slab of alloy near the ridge's edge, flexing the fingers that had clutched her so tightly during the flight trial, his muscles still humming with residual adrenaline. Neither of them said it out loud, but everything had changed. The trial wasn't just about flight or dominance or who could dodge the most debris. It was a claim and a promise. Damon wasn't just her passenger anymore, and even if he didn't fully understand every nuance of Talvor and customs, he understood loyalty when he saw it. Nina had chosen him in front of her kind, had risked her life to defend his place by her side. That meant something. He finally broke the silence. "So now that I'm yours, what happens if I screw up?" Nina's wings twitched as she turned to him. "Then your death reflects on me." Comforting. She sat opposite him, claws folding neatly over her knees. "But you won't screw up. That's a lot of faith in a guy who's mostly good at rerouting wires and talking down stubborn AI cores. I've seen humans with more experience panic and less danger. You don't panic, you think. You adapt. Still doesn't make me combat ready." She tilted her head slightly. "You don't need to be, that's what I'm for." He smirked. "So I'm the brains, you're the claws. A flicker of amusement crossed her face, something like that. They rested there as the clouds continued to shift in thin, letting pale, sickly light stretch across the wreck-strewn valley. Damon worked on recalibrating his makeshift signal ghost, boosting the pulse to mimic troop movements in a nearby quadrant, anything to give potential hunters a false trail. As he calibrated the wave modulation, a strange distortion pattern blinked across his scanner. He frowned, adjusted the lens. It wasn't interference, it was encrypted chatter. Faint, old encryption, non-human. "Nina," he said, gesturing her over. She crouched beside him without a word, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. "This isn't ours," he said. "It's bouncing through old orbital junk and dead satellites, but it's strong, too clean to be random static. Somebody's sending orders, deep burst code." She studied the signal, her expression darkening. "This pattern, it's not Talvarin, it's not human either. It's Dominion script, modified." Dominion. Damon looked at her. "They've been gone for a decade, wiped out in the third trade purge. They don't speak from the grave. This is someone else. Someone repurposing their language to hide what they're doing." He ran a deeper scan. "It's coordinating pulse spikes across the storm grid. Someone's maintaining the electromagnetic distortion. That's why I can't get a clean beacon out. The storms aren't weather, they're artificial." Nina stood slowly and deliberate. "This whole region is a cage. The crashed ships, the drones, the corrupted terrain, it's not chaos, it's control." Damon nodded. "Which means we weren't shot down by chance. Someone lured us in." Nina's wings flared as she paced. They knew we'd investigate a sudden energy spike in neutral airspace. They waited, and now they want to see who survives, or who adapts fast enough to be worth capturing. That landed heavier than either of them expected. Damon set the scanner down and looked at her. "We need to disable the storm generator. There's more than one." "I know, but if we can take down one of the cores, the others might go unstable. It's not perfect, but it could give us a window. Long enough to punch a signal out, call for a vac, maybe figure out who's running this." Nina studied him, amber eyes sharp. "You have the mind of a tactician. I just hate being a lab rat." She stepped closer, kneeling until they were eye level. "Then we do this together. You guide, I fly, we destroy it." It wasn't a question, it was a pact. Damon worked late into the next hour, configuring a path to the nearest pulse spike. It came from deep within a chasm littered with broken shield arrays and half-buried drone hangars, likely where one of the older Dominion storm generators had been embedded. The signal bounced off the walls like sonar, and Damon could track its rhythmic pulse from the cliff's edge. Nina mapped the terrain from the sky, returning with rough estimates of enemy drone patterns and weather breaks. They formed a crude plan. Sneak through the lower level of the wreckage during a signal cooldown, reach the core, overload it using Damon's EMP inverter, then get out before the discharge collapsed the whole system around them. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was the only shot they had. As the sky darkened again with faint hints of a fresh storm building in the distance, Nina stood at the cliff's edge, wings ready. "You trust me not to drop you?" she asked. Damon climbed onto her back this time, looping his arms around her collar harness. "You've held on through worse, I trust you." Her wings flared with a deep electric hum. "Good, because I am not letting go." She launched them into the air again, diving straight into the mouth of the storm. Her claws angled like blades, her eyes locked ahead. Damon's pulse pounded in time with the rhythm of her wings. Beneath them, the shattered world prepared to test their resolve. But they were no longer lone survivors. They were bonded, and they were coming for the heart of the storm. The chasm yawned beneath them like a wound in the planet's crust, its walls jagged with shattered alloys, half-submerged wreckage, and veins of glowing copper that pulsed with unnatural rhythm. Damon clung tightly to Nina's back, his fingers locked into the thick leather harness strapped across her chest. The wind in the gorge was erratic, buffeted by turbulence from the storm's manipulated currents, and Nina had to fight for every meter of descent. She maneuvered with controlled precision, her wings crackling with intermittent surges of electricity as she bled off charge to avoid triggering proximity sensors hidden in the walls. Above them, the sky roared with artificial thunder, more machine than weather, and behind them, the signal from the pulse beacon Damon had traced earlier beat in slow, deliberate intervals like a mechanical heartbeat. They weren't flying into chaos anymore. They were flying into design. The entrance to the buried facility came into view like the mouth of an ancient ruin, angled metal flanked by disassembled plating and shattered Dominion glyphs. Nina landed silently on a ledge just outside the opening, her talons barely tapping the metal. Damon dismounted, his legs shaky but functional. He crouched beside her and pulled up his scanner, confirming what they both suspected. The pulse was coming from inside the chasm's deepest vault. The emitter core was still operational, drawing power from buried Dominion engines that shouldn't have lasted this long. "This place is older than the trade purge," Damon muttered as he checked the relay readings. "They've kept it alive through grafted tech, human Talvarin, even rogue synth. It's a Frankenstein machine." Nina crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the corridor ahead. "Whoever controls it isn't just keeping the storm alive. They're watching, waiting." "Then we go quiet," he said. "I've got a cloaking loop. Not perfect, but it'll mask our heat signatures if we stay within 15 meters of each other. Should get us past the sentries." "Good," she said. "Then stay close." They moved in tandem through the corridor, the air dense with static, and the faint hiss of dormant systems waiting to come alive. Damon activated the loop and slipped the small emitter into Nina's belt. Her wings folded tightly against her back, and she moved with surprising silence for someone of her size. Damon had never seen her like this before, less like a warrior, more like a predator. Controlled, calculated, deadly. They passed rows of rusted scaffolding and power conduits etched with alien script, the symbols dim but still humming with latent charge. Damon's fingers itched to decode them, but there was no time. They reached the inner chamber after nearly 10 minutes of careful movement, stopping just inside a massive vault where the storm emitter pulsed within a spherical generator. The machine floated above a hexagonal platform suspended by graviton coils, its surface arcing with electricity, long cables slithering into the floor and walls like veins in a living organism. At least 4 automated drones hovered near the base, their scanning lights slowly panning the room in rhythmic intervals. Nina tapped Damon's shoulder and pointed toward a maintenance hatch on the far wall. He nodded, adjusting the emitter's frequency, then whispered, "Once I get inside, I can use the inverter to force a surge. That'll cascade through the network and trigger a local shutdown, but it'll blow the core and the grav coils, keeping it suspended." She looked at him. "How long until it collapses?" 5, maybe 6 minutes once I trigger it." "An extraction. That's all you." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be ready." While she moved to intercept any possible surprises from the upper ducts, Damon crawled into the hatch and descended into the inner circuitry. The space was tight, filled with wiring and humming conduits that pulsed with sickly blue light. Every movement sent a low vibration through the hull. He pulled the inverter from his pack and connected it to the central feed node, fingers flying across the makeshift interface as he rerouted the surge path and bypassed Dominion failsafes. The inverter pulsed green. Ready. He exhaled. Then he activated the overload. Immediately, the hum in the chamber rose in pitch. Sparks danced across the emitter core as the graviton coils began to destabilize. Outside, the drone stirred. One turned toward the hatch, red sensors lighting up. Damon scrambled backward just as Nina dropped from above with a sound like thunder cracking open steel. Her wings spread wide as she struck the first drone with a full-body slam, claws ripping through armor, electricity discharging in a blinding arc. The second drone fired a plasma bolt that missed Damon by inches, but Nina was already in the air again, swooping low to tear it in half mid-turn. The third and fourth opened fire, but Nina twisted through the blasts like wind given form, using the debris and corners to ricochet her movement in erratic patterns. Damon shouted her name as the platform beneath the emitter started to give. Time was up. She scooped him up mid-run, wrapping both arms around him, and with one massive wing beat launched them through the vault's upper exit just as the core ruptured. The explosion wasn't fire. It was light noise force. The storm outside screamed in response, and the entire facility beneath them buckled as gravity lost meaning. Damon held tightly as Nina pumped her wings against the collapsing pressure wave, navigating debris, fire, and wild magnetic pulses as they clawed for altitude. Every beat of her wings was labored. Every second the storm above cracked open more, retreating like an injured beast. They broke through the cloud's ceiling just as the sky itself seemed to tear in two. A shockwave rippled outward, and for the first time since his crash, Damon saw sunlight, a pale, filtered light through fractured clouds. The storm grid was breaking. He looked up at her breathless. "We did it!" She didn't answer right away. Her body was shaking, wings singed, and one arm bleeding from a fresh gash across her shoulder. "I said I wouldn't let you fall," she muttered through gritted teeth. "So I didn't." He reached up, touching her face gently. "You didn't, and I won't forget it." She kept flying slower now, but steady. Below them, the storm-racked battlefield was no longer completely hidden. The shadows were peeling back, and someone somewhere would be watching the change. They would know something had gone wrong, and that someone had just fought back. They didn't land immediately. Nina flew low and fast over the partially cleared wreck field, navigating currents that were no longer fully hostile, but still far from safe. The sky crackled in protest, as though it knew its grip on the terrain had loosened. Sparks still danced along fractured satellite towers, and the clouds above fought to reconvene, but the storm's coordination was gone. It had no rhythm anymore, no heartbeat. Damon watched the chaos from her arms, pulse still racing, ears ringing from the shockwave they had barely escaped. The storm generator was destroyed. The skis were breathing again, but so were the ones who had built it, and he didn't believe for a second they'd stay silent. Eventually, Nina spotted a jagged plateau above the old wrecks, a place with wide visibility and only one natural path in. She landed hard, her knees buckling slightly on impact, and Damon jumped down to help stabilize her. Her wing feathers were burned at the edges, shoulders bleeding freely, and her breathing had gone from sharp to shallow. But she waved him off when he tried to inspect the wounds, collapsing against the sloped stone beside them with her claws extended in the dirt. Her body still crackled faintly from the power. She discharged inside the generator chamber, the residual charge clinging to her like vapor. "I told you," she muttered, her voice thin but laced with iron. "You don't fall unless I do first." Damon crouched beside her, placing a stabilizer pad from his survival kit onto the worst of the cuts. "Yeah, well, I don't plan to let that happen either." She looked at him sideways, the barest smirk flickering across her face before she let her eyes close for a moment. He kept working. She didn't argue again. As her wounds stabilized and the adrenaline began to fade from both of them, Damon finally activated the backup signal booster. With the storm distortion cleared, even partially, the pulse caught onto a frequency. It was weak but functional. He encrypted a distress call and embedded location data, piggybacking the message across remaining satellites still in low orbit. He didn't know who would answer, an outpost, a patrol ship, maybe nothing at all, but the signal was out. It was more than they'd had since crashing. "Help's officially a maybe," he said, dropping down beside her again. "We just have to survive until then." Nina opened one eye. "Survival's boring. I prefer combat." "Of course you do." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet strangely heavy. Damon kept thinking about the facility, about the Dominion code, the hybrid tech, the precision in the storms. That wasn't just a trap for unlucky ships. That was testing. That was control. Someone had gone to a lot of effort to weaponize weather and hide the evidence inside ancient tech ruins. He turned the thought over and over, trying to make the pieces fit, until the silence was broken by a sound that made every nerve in his body go rigid. Footsteps. Not drones, not atmospheric rattle, actual footsteps crunching over debris, careful but confident. Nina's eyes opened again instantly. She was on her feet before Damon could fully rise, claws extended, wings twitching with fatigue, but still rising to shield him. The approach was coming from the slope, deliberate, slow, a single figure walking up the incline as though he owned the ground. The man wore repurposed scout armor, matte gray with Dominion markings that had been burned off. His helmet was off, revealing pale skin, a cybernetic implant along his temple, and a mouth that curled with smug control. Behind him, 3 bipedal drones hovered in triangular formation, weapons stowed but active. "Quite a performance," the man said casually, stopping a safe distance away. "Didn't expect you to survive the fall. Fewer still get through the core." Nina didn't move. "State your allegiance." "I'm not here to shoot you," he replied. "I'm here to talk." Damon stepped forward slightly, anger simmering. "You built this storm grid. You turned this place into a trap." The man shrugged. "We inherited it. Dominion junk still hums if you know how to whisper to it. We just cleaned it up a bit, added some features. You know how it is. If you find an old knife, you sharpen it." "Who's we?" Damon asked. He smiled. "Doesn't matter. The ones who matter already know your name. Yours too, Stormclaw Exile. You weren't supposed to make it this far, but you did. That makes you interesting." Nina narrowed her eyes. "We're not interested in your experiments." "Then don't flatter yourselves," the man said smoothly. "You're not the target, just the variable. We didn't think a human technician and a disgraced flyer could crack a generator. That's on us. So now we reevaluate." Damon's fists clenched. "You used the storms to down ships. How many people have you killed playing puppet master?" "It's not about death," the man replied. "It's about response. The war over, but the machines don't know that. They need new rules, new tests. You too gave us data we didn't expect. Consider yourselves useful." "You're insane." "No, I'm practical." He pointed at the sky. "The generator you destroyed, there are more. But now we know someone like you can disrupt them. That's a risk we'll correct." Nina took a step forward, every muscle in her body tensed. "You're saying we helped you." "I'm saying you showed us a flaw. We'll fix it." Damon stepped up beside her. "Or we keep breaking every flaw we find, one by one." The man gave a shallow nod. "That's a bold threat for someone who just sent a distressed signal on a channel we've been watching for weeks." "You're bluffing," Damon said. The man turned, signaling to one of his drones. "Maybe, maybe not, but just in case we'll pull back for now." Nina growled low in her throat, but Damon grabbed her arm gently. "We're not ready for another fight, not yet." The man smiled wider. "Good instincts, human. I'll be watching." He turned and walked back down the slope, the drones lifting to follow. Within moments, they were gone, swallowed by the broken terrain. Nina stood in silence, her wings shuddering once before folding. "They'll be back," Damon said quietly. "I know," she replied. He looked up at her, then out at the storm-cleared sky. "So we make a plan, and this time we don't just survive, we hit them first." Her claws flexed at her side. "Then let's start hunting." The plateau was quiet again after the stranger and his machines vanished, but neither Damon nor Nina believed the silence would last. The threat hadn't gone away, it had simply stepped into the shadows. They had seen its face, heard its intentions, and now they were marked. It wasn't just about escaping anymore, it wasn't even about survival. Damon understood it clearly now in the weight of his gut and the clarity of his thoughts. This place wasn't just a battlefield. It was a proving ground. He and Nina had stepped out of the maze, and instead of killing them, the ones behind the curtain were adjusting the rules. That made them dangerous in return, that made them targets, but it also meant something else, something Nina had said in a low voice after the man disappeared. If we're valuable enough to study, we're valuable enough to disrupt everything they're building. They didn't waste time. Damon pieced together the remains of his signal booster and paired it with Nina's targeting visor. By combining their tech, they created a short-range resident scanner, crude, but good enough to detect the rhythmic pulses of other storm generators. Within an hour, they located 2 more clusters. One was buried deeper in the South Canyon, and the other pulsed faintly beneath a decaying orbital spire to the north. The pulses weren't synchronized anymore, not after the first generator went down. The storm network was fractured. That gave them opportunity. Damon marked both locations on a rough map drawn into the dirt using scrap from a broken comms panel. Nina studied it, crouched beside him, her eyes narrowing as she read the terrain like a soldier reviewing an enemy's pulse. "We hit the spire first," she said, tapping the map. "It's more exposed. The signal is weaker. That means it's under stress." "Could mean a faster overload," Damon replied. "But it also means more patrols. They know it's vulnerable." "Good. That means they'll come to defend it." He looked at her. "That's the plan, isn't it?" "Yes," she said simply. "We hit them where they're weakest. Then we draw them in, and we don't run this time." They moved at nightfall, cloaked under the ragged remnants of the storm, slipping through old canyons and wreckage fields like ghosts. Damon stayed close, adjusting the resident scanner every few kilometers, while Nina took the high ground, flying brief scouting arcs to check for drones or enemy activity. Her injury slowed her flight, but not her resolve. Each movement was deliberate, careful, controlled. She refused to falter. Damon said nothing about the way her claws trembled when she landed, or how she hid the fatigue in her voice. He didn't need to. She wasn't doing it for pride. She was doing it for him, for them, for the mission. And if she wouldn't show weakness, neither would he. They reached the spire's perimeter just before dawn. The structure had once been a Dominion orbital relay, tall, skeletal, with its central core embedded in the canyon below and its tower arcing upward in a shattered spiral of metal and blinking red lights. The pulse was coming from within the base, surrounded by debris and a perimeter of active sensors. Damon peered through the cracked scope of an old scout rifle and saw at least 3 sentry drones circling the tower. 2 others perched on rusted girders scanning the terrain like vultures. They were smarter this time. They were expecting someone. Damon turned to Nina. "I'll need to get inside and reach the power matrix. If I can short the pulse before the next synchronization attempt, I can collapse it, but I'll need time." Nina nodded. "Then I'll buy you time." "Don't get killed for me." "I said you don't fall unless I do first." "That hasn't changed." Before he could answer, she launched into the sky with a thunderous crack of wings, a burst of energy trailing behind her as lightning flickered through her feathers. The drones reacted instantly, rising into combat formations and launching suppressive fire. Damon didn't watch. He ran. He sprinted through the wreckage, slipping between fractured girders and sliding into the lower access corridor beneath the spire. The interior was tighter than the last core, built for maintenance drones rather than human hands. But Damon made it work. He crawled, climbed, rewired, and reprogrammed, fingers flying across makeshift controls. Above, he could hear the sound of battle, thunder clashing against plasma, metal shrieking as it was torn apart, and Nina's primal cry cutting through the mechanical noise. Inside the relay core, Damon reached the matrix, a half-dead cluster of coils surrounded by outdated Dominion converters and patched-in wiring from 6 species technologies. It was a Frankenstein's engine, barely holding together, but it was enough. He planted his last inverter, set the overload sequence, and began the charge. As the seconds counted down, he activated the echo beacon, a pulse that would fake their presence at a different location entirely, drawing reinforcements away from the real exit point. He just hoped Nina was still alive to escape with him. She was. When the core blew and the tower cracked apart in a cascade of fire and smoke, she landed beside him like a falling star, blood on her face, her right wing trailing smoke, but her eyes alive. She didn't wait for words. She grabbed him by the belt, heaved him over her shoulder, and launched into the retreat path. Behind them, the spire collapsed into the canyon, and the storm above blinked, hesitated, and then fell silent. By the time they landed again, this time in a shallow crater filled with old Dominion wreckage, they were both too exhausted to move. Damon collapsed against a broken hull plate, panting, covered in dust and heat residue. Nina lay beside him, her wing curled protectively over his legs. They didn't speak for a while. Then Damon looked over at her and asked, "Still think I'm soft?" She turned her head slowly, eyes glowing dimly through soot and blood. "No, but I still fly better holding you." And despite everything, the blood, the fire, the thunder, they both smiled. Because even if the fight wasn't over, even if more enemies waited in the dark, they had found a rhythm together. A bond forged not by ritual, not by law, but by fire, flight, and the decision to never let the other fall. Dawn broke over the shattered horizon with a weak, pale glow filtered through thinning cloud cover. The air was dry now, no longer charged with electricity or humming with interference. It felt wrong, like a stage after the actors had fled, the tension gone, but the silence left behind thick and wary. Damon sat with his back to a fractured bulkhead, soldering a new casing onto the damaged emitter coil. His hands were steady despite the lack of sleep, but only because he had to keep moving. They had taken out 2 cores, and the storm network had unraveled across half the region. But the war machine behind it wasn't done, and he knew, as did Nina, that the next move wouldn't be one of observation. It would be retaliation. Nina knelt beside the makeshift fire pit, tending to the heat source with one hand while keeping the other resting on the hilt of a salvaged plasma blade. Her wing was wrapped in a crude brace Damon had fashioned from torn wiring and woven mesh. The feathers were scorched and brittle, but she didn't complain. She never did. She simply adjusted, adapted, pushed forward with the same quiet strength that had carried them through wreckage and death and betrayal. Damon watched her profile in the dim light, the way her eyes flicked across the terrain beyond the crater, always alert, always calculating. He wondered when she last allowed herself to relax. He doubted she even remembered. "We can't hit the last core the same way," he said quietly, finishing his repairs and setting the device down between them. "They know we're coming now." Nina didn't look at him. "They're gathering. I've seen at least 2 more patrol clusters moving between the valleys. Light formation, short-range tracking. They're building a perimeter, trying to box us in." She nodded, "or drive us toward the remaining generator, which is buried under a converted Dominion facility, probably crawling with drones, guards, command assets. It won't be like the others." "It won't matter," she said, finally turning toward him. "We finish this, no matter how deep they've buried it." Damon leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I keep thinking about what that man said, about us being data points, about the storm being a test. What if it's bigger than this valley? What if this whole sector is one giant lab? How many people have gone down in flames while they watched from some observation deck taking notes?" "Too many," she said flatly. "But that's not what makes them monsters." He looked at her. "Then what does?" She met his gaze, her voice quiet but hard. "They think survival is permission." That stayed with him long after they doused the fire and began moving. Nina walked now, her wing too damaged for sustained flight, though she said nothing about the pain. Damon adjusted the scanner for ground-based motion tracking, patching in the triangulation nodes from the earlier pulse echo. They took a long arc to the east, cutting through debris fields they hadn't traversed before. The terrain grew more artificial as they approached, less like a crash site, more like an excavation. Slabs of buried Dominion structures jutted from the ground like fossilized bones, half covered in sand and metal shavings. Conduits protruded from beneath cracked plates, and the air itself took on a metallic tang. They reached a cliff edge just before midday, overlooking a sinkhole that opened into the heart of the final facility. The structure was massive, sprawling beneath the surface like the roots of a dead tree. Towers jutted from the crater's rim, encircling the central core where the final generator pulsed with rhythmic precision. But what caught Damon's eye wasn't the tech, it was the movement. Teams of hybrids, humanoid cybernetic Talvor invariants, moved like clockwork patrolling in triads, maintaining the generator adjusting its frequencies. This wasn't an outpost, it was a command node. "They built a civilization out of ruins," he muttered. "They built a weapon out of corpses," Nina corrected, "and they think it's order." Damon pulled out a schematic based on what little data his scanner could pull. "We can't brute force this, not like before. The moment we step inside that crater, we're in a kill box." Nina pointed at a spine of fractured earth to the north. "There, that ridge has buried access tubes. Dominion design used maintenance crosspaces. If you can find a control point, maybe you can rig a reverse pulse from inside." He looked at her. "You mean you want me to go in alone?" "You said it yourself. We can't do this the same way. If they expect both of us, we give them one." "And what about you?" "I'll draw their eyes." Damon frowned. "You're not ready to fight a full contingent, Nina." "I don't have to win," she said. "I just have to be seen." He hesitated, the fear creeping in uninvited, crawling under his skin like frost. "I'm not walking away from that ridge unless I know you're still breathing." She stepped closer, claws resting gently on his chest plate. "Then remember who I am. I carry lightning in my wings, Damon, and even broken I still strike." He nodded. "Joe tight. Then I'll give you the spark." They split at dusk. Damon crawled into the narrow gap at the base of the ridge, sliding through a collapsed duct that stank of scorched coolant and rusted blood. Nina waited until the sun dipped low, then rose, just once into view of the entire facility, her wings flaring in defiance as she screamed a war cry that cracked the canyon walls. The enemy moved instantly. Damon felt the shift in the structure's pulse as guards scrambled, orders barked, drones screamed into the sky. He reached the inner console just as the lockdown began, rerouted power through the central coil, and planted his last signal spike. It would send a surge through the system, revering the storm's control pulse, turning it back on itself. The console lit red 30 seconds. Over the calm, her voice crackled. "I'm still flying." He grinned through the sweat on his brow. "Then let's finish this together." The facility shook as the pulse hit. The generator let out a sound that wasn't mechanical. It was pained, like something ancient had been awakened only to die again. The ground cracked, towers buckled, drones fell from the sky like burning birds. Damon ran, the tunnel collapsing behind him, the world above dissolving into fire and falling metal. At the crater's edge, as the world split open, Nina came down in a swirl of dust and heat, wings folded tight and face streaked with blood and ash. He stumbled toward her, and she caught him before he fell, holding him close, forehead pressed to his. "You didn't fall," she whispered. "Neither did you," he breathed. Around them the storm was gone. For the first time since crashing onto this cursed moon, the sky was blue, the trap was broken. But what came next would be their choice. Smoke curled in slow spirals across the shattered horizon as the wind carried away the last remnants of ash and dust. The storm was gone. The sky, pale but open, stretched wide and endless above them for the first time since Damon had fallen from orbit. He lay on the slope of the crater, lungs burning from the sprint, muscles trembling from effort, but alive, fully, undeniably alive. Beside him, Nina knelt with one hand planted in the soil, her head bowed. Wings slumped and frayed, but her breath steady. They didn't speak for several moments. There was nothing urgent left to say. The generator was destroyed. The storm grid had collapsed. Whatever control those shadow architects had tried to build over this land had cracked and crumbled under their feet. The final pulse Damon triggered had fried half the systems buried beneath the facility. The rest had imploded under the weight of their own stolen power. Damon turned his head and watched Nina as she slowly straightened, her eyes fixed on the broken facility below. Wreckage burned in slow waves, a strange kind of quiet victory playing out across the jagged terrain. The enemy hadn't pursued them. Most of the drones had been wiped out in the surge. The remaining hybrids had scattered once their command signals died. Whatever alliance had created that hidden war machine was shattered. And as Nina finally looked toward him, Damon saw in her eyes that she knew what he knew. This was done. He pushed himself upright with a grunt and sat beside her. The heat had begun to fade from the rocks, leaving only the hum of cooling metal and the rustling sound of retreating wind. For the first time, there were no scans to run, no plans to make. Just the strange, hollow awareness that the mission, unspoken and improvised as it had been, was over. "You didn't leave me," Damon said quietly, rubbing the side of his neck where the escaped duct had scraped him raw. I told you I wouldn't. Her voice was rough, not from pain, but exhaustion. You kept your end, too. He nodded, his gaze sweeping across the open sky. The storm's really gone. For now, she said. There will be others. Other skis, other cages, but not this one. Not anymore. He turned to her and studied her face. Not the warrior's mask she wore in battle, not the fierce defiance that lit her eyes mid-flight, but the real woman beneath the fur and feathers, bruised and beautiful in the quiet. You know we could have died down there. We almost did. And you still came for me, again. She met his gaze, and this time there was no shield in her voice, no half-guarded words. You weren't just a mission. You weren't just survival. You became my reason. His heart thudded hard at that, the weight of her words landing with finality. Not as a surprise, no. The bond had been building for days, forged in fire and lightning. But to hear it spoken, stripped of ritual or battle heat, made it real in a way nothing else had. He reached out and touched her hand, not as a gesture of reassurance, but as something honest. I didn't think I'd find anything after the crash. I figured I was just one more piece of debris in someone else's war. But you saw me. Not just the system's tech. You treated me like a partner. You are. No, he said with a soft smile. I mean a real partner, more than just in war. You carried me, protected me, fought for me, and I tried to give you something back. Even if it was just broken wires and half-baked plans, you deserved more than a storm to fly through. She leaned in slightly, her hand tightening around his. You gave me something no one else ever did. You believed I was more than a weapon. You stayed when I had nothing left but broken wings. Damon hesitated only a moment longer before closing the distance between them, pressing his forehead to hers, their skin warm against the cool air. She didn't move away, her eyes closed, her breath slow. There was no grand speech, no final vow shouted into the wind, just closeness, the kind that didn't need words. He kissed her gentle, deep, grounded in everything they had endured. She kissed him back with the same quiet certainty. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't rushed, it was earned. Later, when they finally moved again, it was not with urgency, but with purpose. They built a camp on the ridge just out of reach of the crater's decay, and from there Damon reassembled the emergency comm array. He boosted the signal on the cleared frequency, and within hours a patrol ship intercepted the transmission. It wasn't a warship, just a salvage cruiser on the edge of the sector, but it was enough. The rescue was calm, efficient, no questions asked, no alarms raised. Just two survivors pulled from the edge of an abandoned battlefield. When asked for names, Nina gave his first. When asked for rank, Damon said unranked, just bonded. They were given quarters aboard the ship for the journey out of the sector. Damon took the inner bunk, and Nina paced for most of the first night, unused to enclosed spaces that didn't rattle with threat. But by the second night she curled beside him, her breath softening into sleep for the first time in days. He held her like she had held him, and neither of them dreamed of storms. Weeks later, when they stood under an open sky on a habitable world, one with no war, no ash, no broken towers, Damon asked her if she wanted to go back to the tavern clans. She said no, they know who I was, you saw who I am. They didn't make a grand speech about staying together, they didn't need one. They simply stayed. They made a home one ridge above a quiet valley where clouds rolled peacefully overhead. She flew again, stronger now, wings whole, and sometimes she carried him, still insisting she flew better with him in her arms. And Damon, never needing to run anymore, finally found the one place he could land and never leave. The storm that brought them together was long gone, but what it left behind was real, and neither of them would ever let the other fall again.